Welcome to this first episode of Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always, the show that reveals the lives, loves and disappointments of groundbreaking researchers and academics. We'll spare none of the details and delve deep into what makes thinkers within our school tick. This is a raw and unedited insight into the fascinating inner thoughts and rarely shared experiences of some of the most fascinating people in our community, scholars. This series is brought to you by QUT's School of Public Health and Social Work. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Today on the show, we have three erudite and intriguing lecturers and researchers from PHSW. And before we get rolling, I'll introduce them. First up, we have Dr. Yvette Miller, who is a lecturer in public health and a researcher whose main focus is how to produce better outcomes in maternal health care for women. And one of her key points of social advocacy is to include women in the design of healthcare programs. We can chat about that later. Dr. Kaeleen Dingle spent 10 years as an epidemiologist and 18 in emergency nursing and international health, working in hospitals and remote health centres throughout Australia, New Zealand and the Philippines, and also within the Australian Red Cross before being a late bloomer in academia and getting her PhD and joining us. Her research interests include life course epidemiology, sexual health, psychiatric epidemiology, and teaching evidence-based healthcare. Dr. Malatzky is a feminist sociologist and a qualitative researcher whose research focuses on the social and place-based dimensions of rural health workforce retention and critical interrogations of power and discourse in the fields of rural health and gender and health. Before I get started, I just want to throw to Christina for a little plug for participants in a current research project she's involved with. Christina, do you want to tell us a little bit about that project and maybe some people listening will be interested?
Sure. So I have a current project which is looking at the relationship between gender dynamics within the rural medical workforce and the way in which gender-based violence in rural communities is engaged with. So I'm looking to interview, and there are multiple different ways that I've included in my ethics of how we could potentially have those conversations. So either rurally based medical practitioners, or if you've experienced gender-based violence and either disclosing or attempting to disclose that experience to a rurally based doctor. I'm interested in speaking to participants that might fall into either of those categories. So if anyone out there might be interested, please get in contact. And just getting in contact doesn't sort of sign you up for anything. I'll just take you through more detail about the study and see if you might be interested in talking to me.
Thanks, Christina. Okay, let's get going. We always begin the show with a discussion about your hot beverage and the cup that you're drinking it from. So Kaeleen, would you like to get us rolling on that?
Well, mine's very, it's actually a cup that was given to us by QUT Staff Giving, which I think is one of the fantastic things that I love about QUT, that there is a long-standing program that looks at that ways that staff can actually involve themselves in philanthropic endeavours, but this one especially is aimed at funding student bursaries. But really what I love about it is actually the handle. I just love the shape of the handle. You probably can't see it, but it sits off centre, and I quite like that idea.
What are you drinking, Kaeleen?
Oh, at the moment I'm drinking a very cold latte. But yeah, that would be my drink not most mornings lately, but yes, that's generally what I put into the cup.
And do you like it cold, or is it just because?
No, it's just because I got it too early on my walk here. Yep.
What about you, Christina? What are you drinking this morning?
Cup. So I'm going to make sure I've got the angle right. So I finished it already because I have to have my tea first thing in the morning, every morning. And really, I guess I was taught by my mother to plan my day around my tea. So what I'm going to accomplish before my tea and what I'm going to accomplish after my tea. And it served me pretty well so far. And in terms of the label, I've spent a lot of time working in health faculties, and not all of them as diverse as the one that I'm currently employed in. So I was going to say maybe a little act of rebellion, but that's probably a bit too far. but just being around lots of people who don't necessarily have an understanding of the knowledge and expertise that social sciences brings in to the study of health. So it's just a little way of laying claim to my identity and a little bit of who I am, even if it's just a label on a cup. Yeah.
That's a very big cup, Christina.
Yes, tea's very important.
You actually get anything done? Like, does it take you all day to drink that tea?
I know when I need another cup. Because
okay. And Yvette, what are you drinking and what from?
I'm drinking coffee, black, sweetened, which I pretty much am consuming all day from the moment I drag myself out of bed. Prepared on a stovetop, which pretty much just gets regularly
I like the green.
put back on the stove.
I love the green.
Yeah, thanks, Kaeleen. I'm drinking it out of a cup that says "Oh, for Fox's sake," with a picture of a fox in the middle. Can you see it?
Yes.
That pretty much sums up how I feel about most mornings, largely because all my creative thinking happens between the hours of about 10 p.m. and 3 a.m., which used to be entirely manageable in the early parts of my academic career. And I would, have a bit of a sleep in the morning. But unfortunately, as I've accumulated children who irritatingly all seem to be morning people, that's actually impossible, but I haven't been able to turn off my creative brain. So what that means is I'm essentially just operating on 2 hours sleep. And when someone hands me the coffee in the morning, I think they're giving it to me on a cup so that I don't say it out loud.
Very good. I like the way the cup is such a good entry point into knowing you guys better. Okay, I'm really interested in how academics get to be academics, because I think it's a pathway that we don't often talk about and it's not often acknowledged, especially in high schools and sort of career development projects and that kind of thing. So I might kick off with you, Christina, with a kind of, can you give us a small narrative about how you ended up in the academy?
I was going to say luck, but maybe that's not entirely true. I originally wanted to be a historian when I left high school. I loved history and I loved English literature at school. But when I enrolled in university, I just took a unit in anthropology and sociology because it was what was available. And I just fell in love with that way of thinking and that way of understanding the world and really grappling with serious sort of social equity issues. And at the same time, I met who would become my mentor in my honours and my PhD supervisor. So I guess actually fairly early on in my undergraduate degree, I was pretty clear, or I could see the path that I wanted to take and where I thought I could have the best impact in the world with who I am. So yeah, I guess it was actually pretty early on that I realised this was the direction I wanted to go.
And how much of an influence do you think that mentor had on you taking the path that you did?
Pretty significantly, but not in a pushy or aggressive way. I think when I think about it now, I had quite a traditional kind of apprentice-master relationship with my supervisor, and she was and still is a really core person in terms of my scholarly development, but also on a personal level, she was also in my life through major events or processes or periods of time in my early adulthood till now. And she's still the person that I call when I'm in trouble or when I'm elated or when I need some advice. Yeah, so she's played a pretty key role, I think, in my career, and she was always really, I suppose, gave me the advice to be clear about what I wanted and what was my goal, rather than what others around me might assume might be my goals, and to be making decisions based on that.
It sounds like a really significant relationship. Yvette, what about you? How did you find yourself in this space?
I actually started off wanting to be a clinical psychologist, and my first degree is in psychology. But I knew from the start that I was really interested in working, even in that setting, with women. And I was lucky enough, well, through begging and trying to make myself known to a really talented feminist researcher in my psychology department, to be offered a research position, which I mostly took because I wanted her to be my honours supervisor, and she was very much in demand. And also because I was a struggling student in need of money, and so I pretty much said yes to any opportunity for employment. But that job was working on the Australian longitudinal study of women's health, which was at the University of Newcastle at that time, and that's where I did my undergraduate degree. And that's where I really started appreciating population-wide approaches to improving women's health, and that and, you know, that there were things that we could do not on a one-on-one individual level like a clinical psychologist, but rather at very exciting levels like policy change and transforming entire systems that affect women's health. And, you know, as I was, I guess, coming into more awareness of feminist approaches, that started to appeal to me so much more, you know, focusing much more on the political. And so I still applied for a clinical master's position, and I was offered one, but I knew at that time that it probably wasn't the direction I was so sure about anymore. So I took a year off and travelled, and halfway through that realised that there was really no point going back to do a clinical master's when all I wanted to do was be a researcher and to work in epidemiology and public health. And so I came back and started my PhD as soon as I got back, and I've worked in women's health ever since.
Oh, sounds like a mentor had a really big influence on you too. What do you say to young fledgling academics, I guess, who are perhaps a bit reluctant to put themselves out there and to ask and present themselves for opportunities? Because I know sometimes that can be really difficult to do for people.
Yeah, I think at the undergraduate level, we don't really encourage students enough to develop personal relationships with their lecturers and people that they think that they can learn from, but also develop networks with. Actually, one of the things that I've seen work so beautifully is Kaeleen's approach, who's also on the panel, because we had offices that were adjacent to each other, and I would see students come and go all day. And obviously Kaeleen's doing something great that encourages students to actually want to have conversations with her about that kind of stuff and to develop personal relationships and personal connections with her. But I would say largely, you know, in talking to students, most of them feel as though there's a real distance between, certainly in undergraduate, between their lecturers and unit coordinators, the academics that they're learning with, and the student body. And I think that's something that we could really, you know, do a better job of in terms of reaching out in a much more personal way with our undergraduate students. And that would be great for them as well as us, because we would very quickly realise, you know, where we have common interests and where we could really develop individualised kind of career development plans for our undergraduate students.
What do you say to that, Kaeleen? You just got a pretty big
Well, I think Yvette's been very generous, because at the time I was the course coordinator. But probably what I did do, which was slightly different, was that I actually opened up and just had drop-in appointments. So rather than them just coming to me to talk about a problem, I was trying to, at that time, encourage, especially at that time I was the undergraduate course coordinator, and with the redevelopment we developed where students actually had 5 electives, and I was really trying to get the students and encourage students to actually think a little bit more strategically about using those, and so I was trying to get them to actually come and talk about their progression and where they wanted to be, and that opened up conversations, and that actually opened up conversations with them about trying to identify students who were really interested in doing extra work outside in the research space, because we've got some fantastic students who actually are really keen to do that, and keen, then the other side, keen to get into the volunteering and find out what is there out there. So yeah, so they probably turned up to me because I was the course coordinator, but it did lead to a number of great conversations. And I think it's opening that door, that you are trying to encourage them to talk about their progression, and that way you can start linking them to academics, rather than just getting them to come to you to talk about problems and get things signed off, which is usually what you see them for.
Yeah, sounds like a good approach, Kaeleen. We were having, speaking of student relationships, we were having a kind of pre-show chat, and what we discovered was that all of you were first in family students, and also students from rural communities. So I'd really like to know more about how that's affected your empathy for students, or your capacity to mentor them and grow them through some of, some challenges at university. So anyone like to jump in and speak to that?
Well, I could probably, because one of the issues with how I came to public health is a slightly different road to both Yvette's and Christina. Was I actually came late into public health, and that was originally I was in nursing, and then had been for a long time, did a bit of work as a nurse educator, and for a very short period was a nurse academic when the course that I developed in emergency nursing went into a graduate diploma at Melbourne Uni. And I had a short time, but I remember thinking, I can't possibly do a PhD. I don't think I've got a PhD in me. So that wasn't, I thought, no, that's not the route, and then was very interested and had been working for a couple of years to try to get overseas with either MSF or Red Cross. And that was the angle that I went on, and was lucky enough to work with Red Cross in Eritrea, first of all in Sudan and then Eritrea. And very quickly, I realised that it wasn't my nursing skills, that although they were useful to a certain extent, and my emergency and trauma skills were useful to a certain extent, the vast majority of nurses I was working with had seen much more trauma and were much more skilled trauma in low resource communities, were much more skilled than I was ever at providing those skills. What I needed was really to understand public health. And it was a lot of the both reporting that public health back and trying to understand mass situations and why these things were happening, because nursing didn't give me those answers. So I ended up coming back and doing a Masters of Public Health in Tropical Health, and a program that unfortunately has since ended at UQ, but that very was aimed at moulding tropical health, public health and international health. And ended up going, doing and the part of that was doing field work. So you actually did field work overseas. And so eventually I thought, well, I'll continue trying to work with Red Cross or MSF, but ended up getting dengue fever and getting it rather badly. So that sort of that makes it much harder to do that. And so started doing some RA work and stayed with some nursing work, and then got offered by some academics. So similar story, some academics that I'd got to know and thought a lot of, who all turned out to be academics who did their PhDs later in life. So one, Alexandra Clavarino, Zandy was a social worker for a long time and then did her PhD later. And Gail Williams, who was a statistician, but because of her children and because at that time it was quite difficult in mathematics, and even though she was an incredible high achiever, she ended up waiting and doing her PhD later while she was having kids. So both of them were incredibly supportive, and even though I didn't think that I could possibly do a PhD, they were incredibly encouraging and got me over that line. And even to the point when I applied for scholarships, I kept thinking, well, I won't get it this year, I'll actually can use the year where I fail to improve myself and enroll in more research units. So I'll actually understand what I'm supposed to be doing. And then I went and got the scholarship. In fact, got both, which was pretty amazing. Well, you can only take one, but I ended up getting an NH and NRSA scholarship, which was pretty exciting. And then I thought, bloody hell, now I actually have to do this PhD. And now, like for me, I was in my late 40s by that stage. So it was a very different road in that. And it's probably taken me quite a long time to actually believe that I am an academic and feel confident in that role, because of there aren't that many of us who, although once you actually talk, there are a lot of people, but especially women who end up coming into PhDs later. Yeah, now I've forgotten your original question. And it's so bloody typical.
Where's Donna? Yvette, how was your kind of experience in a rural community and being first in family? How's that affected your...
Oh, that was the question.
Your teaching.
How has it affected my...
relationships with students, your understanding of what people are going through when they come to university? It can be quite daunting sometimes, especially...
Yeah, I think there's just a lot of assumptions that are made within a university setting about what our students know in terms of navigating a system. I was actually having a conversation with my son this morning, who is in the beginnings of his university studies, about, you know, what a difference his experience is compared to the one that both both me and his dad had. We were both first in family, and you know, he's studying the same area that both of us studied. He's doing it within a school that his dad is the you know, academic director of. So he has two parents who, you know, are probably at the other end of the spectrum from what both his dad and I had, in terms of not only understanding the discipline, but also very much understanding how university systems work. And when I compare that to my experience, you know, nobody in my high school ever spoke to me about how choosing certain subjects for year 11 and 12 would have an impact on my eligibility for applying for certain university studies. So it wasn't until actually halfway through year 11 when my mum said to me, you know, we probably should find out what kind of university courses you might be interested in doing if you want to go and do this university thing. And so I actually sent off a written form to request the UAC book, which then came in the post about a month later, and sat there pouring through and saw these prerequisites, you know, long after I'd actually chosen the subjects that I was going to be doing for my high school certificate, which would have a huge impact on that. And so even at the high school level, you know, the assumption in that small town was that that people wouldn't be going to university. And as a result, nobody spoke to me about the implications of anything that was happening in high school for my accessibility to that. Certainly when I then turned up to university for my undergraduate degree, there was no advice about how to navigate the system or how things worked. And I would have to say that, you know, even right at the end of my degree, I still didn't quite understand what academics did. You know, I would see them turn up for lectures. Nobody ever really told me that when they weren't teaching us, they were off doing a whole lot of other things, or told us what those things looked like. And so I guess that's one of the things that I try to do in my undergraduate teaching, certainly, is bring in very realistic examples of my successes and failures, and the lessons that I've learned in my research, and try to weave that into their learning as part of their undergraduate studies. Luckily, you know, the units that I teach in public health are for our third year students, and they're very practical units. And so it provides me lots of great opportunities to weave that in, because we're talking about all the messiness of involved in public health work on the ground. But I think it's something that we could probably do a better job of, even back at the high school level, and probably particularly in regional areas or areas in which we don't see much transition between high school to university, to actually go around and do a kind of roadshow almost, and communicate, you know, what academics do and how universities work a lot more to students, so that they come in with a bit more confidence about having a place there and knowing how to navigate a position within that academic environment.
It's like this hidden, mysterious profession, isn't it? I remember
Yes, I think it absolutely is.
I think at high school I was quite a high achieving student and always really passionate and curious, and because I excelled in sort of arts subjects, the only recommendation was that I should be a lawyer, and no one once suggested that I go into academia, which I kind of look back on and think, wow, that's like, it's almost like I was ready and ripe to sort of head there straight away. So it's quite interesting, isn't it? I might also add, while we're talking about kind of defining terms and making assumptions that people know what we're talking about, first in family, I didn't actually know what that meant for a really long time, and was aghast the first time someone labelled me as being first in family, as though it was some sort of, in fact, I think the term itself is a little bit problematic. But it actually means that you're the first person in your family to attend university, and it does have some sort of consequences for you in terms of outcomes. So would that be a correct description of the term?
Yes, yes.
Okay with that? Yeah, good. Okay.
That's my understanding, and I would certainly agree that it just puts you a little bit behind the eight ball, not only in terms of the kind of feelings that Kaeleen was talking about, in terms of, you know, this real imposter syndrome, because if you don't have any models in your family for somebody who's been to university, it's a lot more difficult to imagine yourself there. But I think also just in terms of the amount of energy that you have to expend trying to understand the rules, which I think, you know, pardon?
And the language.
Yeah. The language and the rules, and yeah, what it means to be a university student.
Yeah, agreed. Christina, how has all of this impacted on the way you approach your teaching and relationships with students?
I think that neither of my parents went to university, sort of gave me an appreciation of you know, what we've been speaking about, that all students won't necessarily be coming in with that kind of capital around how universities work, and some of the language that we use. And I always try to be, you know, I try to encourage students to, because I teach first year, first semester unit, you know, I try to be very honest with them and say, like, I've spent a lot of time in the university sector. This is sort of my comfort zone in many ways. So please let me know if I'm using language or if I'm talking about things that you actually have no idea what I'm talking about. And I guess in terms of coming from a rural community, I actually stayed living rurally throughout my undergraduate degree, because UWA just happened to have a campus where I come from in the southwest of Western Australia. But I know a lot of my close friends who did move away to go to university were really frustrated by the differences between themselves and their new friends who were metro based. This is actually my only third year of life living metro. In terms of what it is that they were juggling. So for them, it wasn't just entering university. They'd left their whole social support. They were negotiating living independently, providing for themselves, whereas their friends, you know, lots of their parents were still making their bed, and, you know, they were coming home to dinner, and really not a great deal had shifted in terms of what life had been in high school, in terms of, you know, what it was in first year university. So I think it's just giving me an appreciation of what students who might be sort of moving to Brisbane from rural communities might be sort of negotiating, and just being realistic and I suppose respectful of those different negotiations that are happening. And it's not all about university study as such, but actually creating a new home and a new network in a new environment.
Yeah, I think these are really important things that I'm glad that we've discussed today. Now, if you're thinking about switching off, don't, because we're getting to the really meaty part of the conversation now. And I'm looking forward to the answers to this question so much. So all of our guests today are in one way or another sort of enacting feminism in their daily lived lives and challenging perhaps some of the assumptions and the status quo around what it is to be a woman in academia. So I was just wondering from all of you, what can we do better to make the academic space safer for women? And do you have any experiences that you feel comfortable about sharing that might shed a little bit of light on how we can do that better?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off talking about this. In terms of, I think what we can do to make it safer or make it slightly more easy for women in academia to achieve what their male counterparts achieve. There's a lot of really big things we can do, but there's also a lot of really small things we can do. So I, spent a lot of time once I'd had a couple of children reflecting on how I was responding when I returned to work, and talking to some close female academic colleagues about how they felt within the workplace. And there's a lot of things that we do to try to manage for other people, I guess, our femaleness in the workplace, and on top of that, our caregiver responsibilities and our roles as parents. And almost all of the women I spoke to said that they made up excuses about why they couldn't attend meetings at certain times of day, rather than actually being open and honest about the fact that they were simultaneously engaged in quite demanding caregiver responsibilities. And so one of the things I started doing was just being really open about that. And in fact, even sometimes when, according to my personal schedule, I could make a meeting at 3:30, actually declining on the basis of caregiver responsibilities and making really clear that that's what I was doing. And when I shared this with my male partner, who's also an academic, and who was working in, a high-level leadership role at the time, an executive role within a university, and had a lot of meetings that he was being asked to attend during all hours of the day, he actually adopted the same approach, and would universally decline meetings that would occur before 9 a.m., sometimes up to 10 a.m., and certainly any time from about 2:30 onwards, specifically citing that that he had caregiver responsibilities. And I think just tiny changes like that start to shift the culture. We now at QT have an Athena Swan action plan that specifically talks about things like meeting times to ensure accessibility for women in academia. And I think we should all be trying to enforce that, however uncomfortable it is. I've had a lot of pushback when I've said, no, sorry, you're going to have to change this regularly scheduled meeting time because it doesn't comply with the Athena Swan action plan. In some cases, that's taken a whole year because people have come back and said, oh, well, we've locked those meetings in for the year now. It's a regular meeting time, so we can look at reviewing it next year. But there's already been small wins in that regard. And I think people who, certainly I think that's something as you move into a more senior academic role that we need to be doing to protect our, less senior colleagues who probably don't feel as comfortable challenging those very small kind of organizational aspects that actually make a huge difference. The acceptability of recognizing that, you have other responsibilities that are probably associated with being a woman, I think are going to make it a lot easier if we keep pushing back and resisting on those really small things. The other thing I think that that we could all do better is probably to challenge in the moment episodes of sexism in the workplace, which includes assumptions about availability, but also things like, how people respond to parental leave, or, there's a lot of things that we could probably challenge a little bit more in the moment as stories are told in the workplace, to try to change the stories that our colleagues hear and make them feel safer.
Some good thoughts there. And thank you for representing us and always being an advocate. In fact, if power gives us anything, that's what it gives us, right? Kaeleen.
I think the main thing for me has been also thinking about the other caregiver roles, because I don't have children, but many of the academics that are around, and especially female academics, but I think also, male academics who, like Yvette said, unless they're challenged and unless they start thinking about their own responsibilities and how that they don't think about their own caregiving roles. And I think for me, one of the things is, because I'm also, and probably this is related partly to that first in family issue, is there's a lot of students in our group who are mature age students who come after a long time in either the clinical space or having children and wanting to come back to academia. And the majority are women, but some are also men who might also be going through a second career path because of first career. And oftentimes, I think in that space, what they're learning, and I learnt this also with my brother who ended up becoming the main caregiver because he was at university, had got a redundancy, was at university and trying to find a new space, that it was quite difficult for him, and he could not sort of admit that he had family responsibilities because of the space that exists that doesn't allow that. And I think men close that down so often with their male colleagues as well as their female colleagues. And I think and especially as we age, there are going to be so many more people who need to be full-time or part-time caregivers, who will need to take breaks, and that we've got to recognise that and really start, instead of this whole 24-hour, 7 days a week of academia. And I know a lot of people outside don't see that side, but I think that's the difficulty that I've found, especially when I'm comparing myself to other people working, is that amount of time that's taken up and gradually gets encroached on weekends, holidays, and all sorts of things, because the cycle just keeps going on. And I think that's something that, and it's probably true in other jobs as well, in the public service, that's increasingly becoming the case, that we're constantly encroaching on other areas and work becomes all consuming. Yeah.
Christina?
I have to say that probably the most distressing part of my career to date has been sort of how I was treated after returning to work, having a child, and being told, really quite explicitly by some colleagues that I would be, not as good at my job, and I just have to sort of accept that, and maybe when my child was, older, I could, be good again. And that was really very devastating to me, because I worked really hard to establish my academic career, and it was really, this is, in my adult life, all that I've ever wanted to do. But it was also very ironic, because I was in some ways sort of living the findings of my own PhD research, where I was very much aware that I was no longer taken seriously professionally, but I was also not considered or not perceived to be a good mum, because I went back to work full time when my baby was relatively young. So I guess I was also quite privileged that I had that kind of knowledge that had really come from all the incredible women who shared their stories with me in my PhD research, to sort of recognise that what I was experiencing wasn't a reflection of my sort of personal inadequacies, but a reflection of the societal discourses that really inform sort of our expectations around what women's lives and trajectories will look like. So I try to use those voices to drown out some of those others. And I guess for me, in terms of how can we sort of make workplaces safer for women, I think we need to stop assuming either implicitly or explicitly that all of our workers are men. and that women sort of need to fit in or somehow be accommodated into a pre-existing sort of system. So I think, you know, big scale, we need to really quite radically undo the way that we sort of structure work and the way that we conceptualize work, and sort of coming back to what, you know, both Yvette and Kaeleen have been talking about, the way that we conceptualize unpaid work, which, you know, disproportionately women sort of undertake the majority of that work, as being actually very productive, very necessary for the sustainability of our society. So I think if we do that, if we sort of rethink the way that we think about work and the way that we structure work, our workplaces will be safer for people of all genders, really. But
yeah. Can I just add to that? I think that's actually the level at which, when I talked about big changes and small changes, you know, I think we simultaneously need to be looking at those big system changes and assumptions within the system that we don't see anymore. And that is that essentially, you know, academic institutions, like all of those really, those pre-existing systems are set up in a very patriarchal way. Yeah. They don't work according to, you know, feminist management systems, which would, you know, be very flexible and, you know, would involve much more gift economy and much less rigidity in hours and roles and all of those things. And I think, you know, at the bigger level, we can resist some of those assumptions as well. Yeah, I'm so saddened to hear about Christina's experiences, but, you know, as she was talking, I was also almost triggered about so many interactions that I've had that have really reinforced, you know, my place as a woman as being less and with less expectations, but have also explicitly held me back. I remember as a postdoc, before I had any children, or had expressed any plans to have any children, initiating a conversation with my supervisor about promotion. And the comment that came back to me was, well, I don't think we'd want to put you on a higher salary, which we'd then have to pay you more for your upcoming maternity leave. Which spoke very clearly about, I'd actually forgotten that conversation until I heard Christina speaking about.
What Yvette, you look very young for someone born in the 1800s.
But I also really was interested in asking Christina about, you know, what was your response when you received this constant messaging in the workplace about your capacity, the expectations for your productivity, of your significance, you know, once you'd become a mother and returned to work? How did you react to that?
Oh, I think that's probably my side of internal struggle. So it's also a political struggle, because I, you know, on one hand, I'm so angry, still very angry, about some of those assumptions that are made, some of those messages that I get. But I think my actual response was to work even harder and to be even more explicit about who I was as an academic, and that nothing had changed in terms of my ambition and my goals within my career, and that this was still very much who I was. So I guess that is still my sort of side of struggle, because I'm very clear in my position sort of against these sort of increasing neoliberal techniques within our institution that are really pushing back on individual women to somehow cope and to manage what are actually implications sort of produced through deep structural problems that need deep structural solutions. So I'm very clear on being critical of that, but also a lot of my personal actions are trying to do what I can to still succeed in this career, which does allow the system to maintain the status quo. So I think it is a challenge, and I guess through what we're sort of living out at the moment with COVID and some of the huge job losses that are about to hit our industry, I think that has, you know, poked me a little bit in the ribs in terms of not thinking that I should somehow wait until I'm in what could be perceived to be a more influential position, but to leverage every privilege that we have, and I have many privileges, to to advocate and to use our voices for that change in every avenue that we're given. So I think in a way, some of the changes that we're seeing at the moment have sort of spurred me to do a better job at living my politics, I suppose.
Naomi, can I make a comment?
Yes.
One of the things that I think we also forget in this is that so often even the journey to academia is perceived in the university space through a patriarchal lens.
Yes.
That you're supposed to come out of university, you're this young thing who will work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, who'll then build a career in your youth, who'll go on and you'll end up being, this person. And it so disenfranchises so many people who have the skills, who are either returning to the workforce or want to come into academia after being in the workforce space, who want to change careers, who have been challenged through their lived experience and then want to write about it, reflect on it, and challenge things. And academia so often closes off that. And I've seen it with one of my PhD students who is, has had leave for children, has had leave for sick children, various things. And the difficulty of getting the postgraduate coordinators who are at the higher level, who are only interested in that who think PhDs are young trajectories. And I think there's so many steps where it's all embedded in there, and we've got to just keep challenging it because it's so hard for them. And so many women who are doing their PhDs are being challenged constantly about this because of whether it's pregnancy care, caring responsibilities, all that. And it's so stupid because these men who are making these rules, who are saying these things, forget their own privilege, because who looked after their kids when they were sick? Who looked after their mum? Who looked after, and what did their wives, partners, and give up to actually allow their career to flourish? And I think, anyway.
I think we do definitely get caught in this really difficult situation where, we're trying to, I think one of the best ways of kind of challenging some of those ideas is really just being open and sharing your own experience, in ways that make it clear that everybody doesn't fit the requirements of that organisation or meet the assumptions of the organisation. But at the same time, in doing that, you feel as though you put yourself at risk. And so you're also simultaneously trying to do, as Christina said, all of the things that the organisation requires of you within those assumptions, just so that you can maintain your position within it to try to keep advocating for change. It's a really difficult, thing to straddle, I think, to try to advocate for that change in ways that are very personal and bring the very personal to the political and to the workplace, but simultaneously maintain a position within that institution that allows you to do that. And I guess I'm trying to think of ways in which we can make that easier for people, so that we can advocate for more equitable academia. I mean, I know that, I'm thinking about what Kaeleen said as well. I had a situation about people questioning their own privilege or bringing to light people's privilege. I did, in the last couple of years, have an experience where I was actually at a farewell lunch for an academic colleague who was actually leaving academic life because of the ongoing challenges of trying to maintain all of her domestic responsibilities alongside her partner's very inflexible career. And had decided that really the only solution for survival was to actually leave her, much hard-won academic career in order to do so. And so, funnily enough, we were actually at that particular colleague's farewell lunch, at which the upcoming pregnancy and maternity leave of another one of our colleagues was made. and the male colleague sitting opposite me said across to the fellow male colleague who was sitting next to him, they just take off a year every now and again when they decide to have a baby. And I did, in that one moment, make a conscious decision to call out that assumption and actually highlight what I knew about that particular colleague, which was that, you know, he had several young children at home that his female partner had given up her successful career to take care of so that he could pursue his academic career progression. But I must say, I sat at the rest of that lunch feeling incredibly unsafe, feeling as though I had, you know, revealed myself, kind of leaving out in my mind all of these assumptions about what being a difficult woman in the workplace looks like, and being silenced thereafter because I kind of internalized all of those judgments about myself for having spoken out. And so I'm I guess trying to look for ways in which we can make it easier for people for us to call each other out, all of us, because obviously we're all complicit in maintaining those assumptions within our workplace. And I guess I'm at odds about exactly how we should do that, but I do feel like solidarity might be a critical part of it.
Solidarity is always a really good start. Do you think it would be helpful to have just a very simple program of the kinds of language that people can use to call out things like that? Because I think sometimes this kind of reluctance exists at a language level. So certain phrases that people can employ to let other people know that that's not okay, but you're still okay, and you know, as a person is still welcome in our group, but we just don't stand for those kinds of. Do you think that would be helpful?
Yeah, I think it would be helpful, particularly if they were suggested or shared, you know, among the collective, so that everybody knew in advance what that was going to look like. And so when it happened, you know, it was a bit less of a shock for everybody, including the person who felt compelled to use that language and call it out. I mean, do we have any ideas about what kind of, I mean, I'm just trying different things out on the go, really, and making lots of mistakes along the way. But I think it would be really nice to have a more expert approach to what we could do to encourage more inclusive language. Any ideas?
I think questioning is a good start. So rather than just accepting the comment, maybe asking a little bit more about where it comes from or what it actually means, or do you think that's funny? Because we're laughing. Yeah, it's something that I find quite difficult because I am quite a frank person, so I always know that that's where that's really going to come to the fore, and my culture has taught me to pull it in.
Yeah.
And I think that's the case for a lot of us.
I think it would also be really nice to know or have some guidance, maybe even some mentoring around, like, how do you deal with the uncomfortable silence when you do, you know, truth bomb in those situations? Yeah. Because for me, you know, that's the major inhibitor, I guess, is the fear of being further excluded.
And I think also it's challenging power, even though, you know, we'd like to, you know, at some level we pretend academics all sit on a very even plane and we can debate and discuss. That's clearly not true. That there is a hierarchy, and sometimes it's a hierarchy based on title, but other times it's a hierarchy based on positions in the structure. And, you know, that those unseen favoritisms and things like that happen. So it's, I think, incredibly difficult, but it does need to be done, because if it isn't done, and look, I've been equally complicit in just sitting there and not saying things, or not challenging my own thought systems. But until we start doing it, it's just going to roll along. And I think that's one of the difficulties, especially as we become more corporatized, as academia has become more corporate and more interested in education as a financial product that we sell, then actually what most of us are here for, which is not that. It's the creation of knowledge, the creation of understanding, and hopefully change. That I think that's become even much more difficult, because it's all about the marketing image, it's that sort of thing. It's what people say, not what people are doing. Yeah. Sorry, but Christina's probably better at some of the language things. I probably just get cranky and show my crankiness.
Any thoughts, Christina, on language that we could use to perhaps subvert that some of those narratives that are oppressive for women?
Well, I think for me, this is sort of my discipline background, and training your language is really important, and something that I struggle with a lot, even in my own family, is that I don't let some language go, and sometimes that can be frustrating for people around me, and you get that sort of label of the feminist killjoy when you do that. But it is really important. The language that we use constructs the realities that we live. So I think it's essential that we challenge that language, that we develop some, I suppose, ability or capacity to sit with those silences, and, like sort of Naomi, you sort of included in your reflection, that it doesn't mean relationships end, or that we're not in that sort of dialogue, but we do need to challenge the way that these issues are spoken about within our institutions. I think that's a critical step, and I think from my own sort of my own research, something that really irritates me, and I see a lot, and I think it's probably connected to this sort of corporatization that we're seeing, is this idea that we can deal with these deep structural issues by having sort of a checklist, or these lovely brochures that talk about wonderful things that we're doing, but they remain beautiful brochures and not enacted in practice. So I think for me, it's actually about doing what we're saying we're going to do, rather than making sure that we have lovely procedures and lovely glossy magazines that portray a particular image that may not actually be what's happening on the ground.
Thanks, Christina. Look, I'm going to end on that note, because I love this idea of ending on the beginning of a conversation that that brings to light some of the issues in academia that are, for the most part, silenced and often, surprisingly, go unchallenged. So I'd encourage you all, if you're watching this, to continue this conversation and to continue to investigate the ways that you and your colleagues and your friends and family can continue to kind of call out some of the oppressive language and ideas that are kind of imposed on women in academia and beyond academia itself. And that's why this show is so important, and that's why we're doing it. It's so that we can bring to light some of these ideas and issues, so that perhaps people coming through the ranks don't have to deal with them in the way that we have had to. So thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to presenting another show in the series next week. Thank you.
Thanks, Naomi.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Kaeleen, Christina.